I'm scratch building using styrene. Victory Blue Part 2 on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure and subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. In a recent video, I brought you an introduction to a scratch building project I'm working on for my model railroad layout, which is the Victory Blue processing facility where they make diesel exhaust fluid. In that video, I showed you how I planned out this project based on some reference photos from Google Earth, as well as some photos that I had on hand. And I showed you how I had kind of redesigned the building in order to make it fit and function better on my layout. Also in that video, we built the main structure of the Victory Fuels processing facility. Well, today I'm bringing you part 2 of that build, where we're going to build the internal storage bins that are part of the main structure, and we're going to begin the process of building the elevator leg house. This has been a great scratch building project using styrene, and I think it's going to come out really, really well. Very pleased with how it's looking so far, and I know it's going to serve a great functional purpose on my layout. Do you have some scratch building tips that you'd like to share with us, especially ones for working with styrene? If so, tell us about your tips in the comment section down below. Now, let's head on over to the workbench and we'll pick up right where we left off in building Victory Blue. In the first video in this series, I constructed the main processing structure for Victory Blue, a processor of diesel exhaust fluids and a division of Victory Fuels Incorporated. The next step in construction is going to be to build the 2 large bins that are incorporated into this main structure. I left holes in the roof for these bins in the first video. Some of you asked in the comment section why I didn't simply glue the bins onto the top of the roof. The reason is because the bins will be too heavy and would cause the roof to sag. I could brace up the roof, but I decided that it would be just as easy to simply support the bins by building them all the way up from the floor. I started by removing the 2 support braces that crossed over the holes of the roof where the bins will go. Off camera, I constructed 2 simple boxes from 40 thousandths plain styrene to serve as a base or foundation for these bins inside the structure. I made these to the exact width and depth that I needed the bins to be, and I test fit them in the holes of the roof to make sure that things were going to work well. Next, I constructed 2 more boxes to model the section of the bins that extend through the roof. These are made from the same board and batten styrene that I used to simulate the ribbed steel of the siding and roof for the main structure. These bins are different heights, so I estimated the proportions as close as I could and made these boxes accordingly. I found that the board and batten siding from evergreen scale models had a bit of roughness and some unwanted texture and flash on the surface, so I touched up all of the pieces that I've used with a piece of 400 grit sandpaper. I need these boxes to have perfect corners, so I cut them very carefully and cleaned up all of the edges with sandpaper. I used my base boxes as references, as each level of these bins need to match the other levels perfectly consistently. Using my magnetic gluing jig, I cemented the sides of the boxes together using solvent cement. Again, I can't stress enough the importance of making sure that all of the corners are aligned perfectly and square to match the adjoining boxes. When I had 3 sides of a box cemented together, I set the model up and cemented on the 4th, using a square to keep things true and comparing it to the base in order to keep it consistent. I repeated this process for the 2nd box of the 2nd bin. When the cement on those boxes had set, I sanded the ends lightly to make sure that they were level and perfectly flush all the way around. I also sanded any imperfections in the corners in order to make them look true and perfect. I then proceeded to cement these boxes to the plain styrene foundation boxes that I had constructed earlier. I cemented the boxes from the inside using a micro brush, working carefully to be sure that all of the visible sides were flush. If there was any variance between the boxes anywhere, I tried to make sure that it was pushed to the back of the model where it will be against the backdrop and will not show. With the second level installed on both bins, I test fit them into the holes of the roof. I found that the holes in the roof were slightly small in the dimension from back to front, so I marked where they needed to be trimmed, and I cut out a small piece from the roof, sanding the edge to smooth it and make the bins fit properly. There is a third level to these bins. The top section of the bins have large strengthening ribs that run horizontally around them. The top sections of the bins have large strengthening ribs that run horizontally around them. To construct the walls of this final level, I went back to my 40 thousandths plain styrene and cut a third set of walls for the third pair of boxes. I assembled these boxes in exactly the same way that I had done the previous two, and again I sanded the ends and the corners to make sure that everything was flush and fit perfectly. I cemented these boxes onto the top of the previous level from inside exactly as I had done before. Now the bins are full height. To create the strengthening ribs, I used 20 thousandths by 40 thousandths styrene strips from Evergreen models. I marked the position of the ribs to be a uniform distance apart and used a square to make straight lines around the three visible sides of the bins. I then used my touch and flow applicator to cement these ribs in place, being careful to hold them perfectly on the lines. I worked from the most visible side around the front to the third side, but I positioned the strips so that the strip on the front would cover the ends of the side strips in order to best hide the seams. To accomplish this, I left the front ribs a little long on the side where I had not yet installed the ribs on the side. I then cut them to length after those side ribs were installed. I cut the roof of the bins from 40 thousandths styrene and cemented both roofs in place carefully, again sanding the corners until the seams were all but invisible. To support the bins, I installed a small square piece of styrene floor into this corner of the building. I cemented it into the corner of the structure and then put the bins in place on top of it, checking to make sure they were square and plumb, and then I cemented them to the floor. I tacked the bins to the roof where they go through the roof in places where the roof actually touched the bin sides. I trimmed or flashed these bins along the outside of the roof using 60 thousandths styrene angle. I used my micro mark choppet and a 45-degree miter gauge to cut the angles where the pieces would meet along the front of the bins. I cut the side pieces long to give me some material to work with. I would trim the ends of these later. I cut a miter on one end of the piece that would go along the front wall and used it to help position the first side piece. When I was happy with the placement, I cemented the side piece in place with a touch and flow applicator. I then marked the second end of the front piece of trim and carefully cut the miter on it. I used great care and intentionally cut it a little long and then trimmed it little by little until it was exactly the right length. I matched the corners on the front trim to that on the third side trim, and then I cemented the front trim in place. The trim between the bins was a bit tricky as this is a very narrow space to work in, but I carefully put the trim in place, held it in place with a cotton swab, and cemented it down. When I was happy with the trim on the first bin, I trimmed off the extra length from the back of the angle pieces, and then repeated the entire tedious process for the second bin. And with that, the bins are complete. I began work on the elevator leg house by cutting the sides from 40 thousandths plain styrene. The leg house is 115 scale feet tall and 50 feet wide, with a depth of 36 feet that matches that of the main structure as it's modeled and visible on the layout. When I had the three sides cut, I laid out and marked the placement of the windows, 8 feet below the roof line. I also laid out the series of 4 doors that go down the front corner of the building. I marked these from the inside, and I will cut them from the inside. I was not happy with the doors and windows that I had on hand for this project, so I ordered some new, more suitable doors and windows. Thus, the elevator house had to be put on hold until these new parts arrived. So with that delay, here is where we are. I think these bins came out looking great, and I can't wait to get the extra parts and get the elevator house and the loading shed built to go along with them. Well, I am really pleased with how the main structure of Victory Blue has turned out. Of course, we still have a lot of details to add, and of course we have that elevator housing to complete and a lot of detail parts to go with it. So there's plenty left to this build, and there'll be at least a couple more videos as I show you how I do the entire project all the way to the end. Now, if scratch building is something that is of interest to you, but maybe you've not really tried your hand at it yet, maybe you've been a little afraid to start. Well, I recently did an hour-long live stream where we talked about a variety of materials, adhesives, and techniques that can be a great help if you're starting out in scratch building. I'm going to include an end card link to that video at the very end of this video. So if you watch all the way to the end, you can click on that link and you can learn a little more about scratch building in general there. Well, if you enjoyed this video, here's a link to some more structure building videos that I know you'll enjoy as well, so I hope you'll check them out. Also, take a moment to look at the description down below this video. There you're going to find a link to my Amazon page where I link tools and materials that I use in model railroading, photography, video making, and so much more. Or you can just do your regular Amazon shopping right through that page. You'll also see my Amazon pick of the week, some of the most exciting products that I like to talk about and that I like to use, and I share them with you. You'll also see links to my Patreon page and places where you can connect with me on a variety of social media, so I hope you'll check all of that out in the description down below. Well, hey, be sure and join me each Tuesday as I'll be bringing you more great model railroad videos, and I look forward to seeing you then. Lizzie? And a place where you can do just your... Really?